With that, let's get started. As previously mentioned, Dr. Kevin McCullum is a senior environmental engineer and the data manager for West Central Airshed and Alberta Capital Airshed. Kevin holds a PhD and Master of Science in Environmental Engineering from the University of Alberta with specialties in ambient air quality and river water quality. I invite you to read Kevin's full bio on our website. He's a force in the air quality sector. And with that, I invite him to please kick us off today. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Julie. David probably doesn't remember, but when I was actually back doing my master's a long time ago, he was one of the ones in Alberta Environment that had to sign off on my dye tracer studies a long time ago. But that won't age us, honestly. Let me share my screen. I needed to do this as a trial, didn't I? Everyone should be seeing that screen. No. So it should say webinar October 27, 2022, correct?
Looking good.
That's good. So thanks again, Julie, and welcome everyone for tuning in. One thing I just wanted to raise is that these webinars that we've been putting on are a great way for us to connect and really learn and share important topics such as today's presentation. And it's going to be an interesting one. The background that I'll bring is really just the Airshed model, what we're really doing and how we're setting things up. And if you're not familiar with how the Alberta Airshed model works, it's set up for the Alberta Capital Airshed and West Central Airshed Society. It's the two that we work with. And it's only 2 of 10 airshed organizations in Alberta. So our primary role is really to monitor the ambient air quality and determine the level of pollutants in the air that we're really breathing and we're exposed to. We do this using a range of different monitoring technologies, strategies, data analysis, data, that's my favorite. And then with that, we look at all of these airsheds in Alberta are really multi-stakeholder, not-for-profit. And we primarily use the consensus as a decision-making tool to move forward. And you can see from the screen, there's a whole bunch of different areas that we try and outreach to and share information across the gambit. So when we look at our webinar that we're going to be talking about today, it's very timely. And anybody that's been stuck in traffic will know what it's like. And I'm sure everyone's got that little game on their phone too, where they try and unplug a parking lot. But it is really timely for us. The work that CASA has done really heightens the focus in the relationship between people, traffic, vehicles, and looking at the roads going forward in all the airsheds. I pulled together some data because that's what I like to do. In West Central, what we end up having is just a map of the zone and all the roads that we have. And it's about 33,400 kilometers of roads, trails, and paths. But if we look at just our primary roads, we're looking at about 8,200 kilometers of these primary, secondary, and tertiary roads. So there's quite a footprint out there for just the roads. If we move into the Alberta Capital Airshed, the borders have been expanded. So this is the new borders that we have. And when we look at the layout there, you can't even see some of the areas around the city. So I blew up just the Edmonton region so we can see some of the roads. But we're also looking at about 30,000 kilometers of roads, trails, and paths, again, with about 5,300 kilometers of primary, secondary, and tertiary roads. So I'm going to now pass this over to David to kick us off. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can actually get back to here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin, for kicking us off and for setting the stage. You know, that graphic that you showed around the density of roads is really powerful. And so with that, I'd like to, welcome David to the microphone. David Spink is an environmental engineer. He started his career with Environment Canada and then worked for Alberta Environment for 26 years in several different technical and managerial positions. For the last 18 years, he has worked as an independent consultant, primarily for First Nations and Métis communities, with a focus on oil sands development related to air quality management issues. He is one of the non-government organization board members of the Clean Air Strategic Alliance, CASA, and has been involved in many CASA projects. He, alongside with Yayne-abeba Aklilu, of Alberta Environment and Parks, co-chaired the recent CASA report, Impact of Reduced Transportation on Air Quality. And that's the report that we're so excited to learn more about today. So with that, over to you, David.
Great. Thanks.
Go
Julie,
ahead.
next one, please. Okay, this is the presentation outline, a little background on CASA. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with CASA. A quick overview of the project. There were really four main elements to the project. A little bit of context, and Kevin has provided a little of that in his presentation regarding roads and traffic. And then what the focus of the presentation is going to be is on the analysis that Alberta Environment did, and Airsheds did some analysis as well, but the analysis that Alberta Environment did looking at traffic counts and air quality data and what the measures taken to manage COVID meant in terms of both traffic counts and air quality. And then just a few examples of some of the key messages from the project. So next, please, Julie. So CASA, not-for-profit organization, not part of government, but there because in 1994, the government decided that it would be useful to have a multi-stakeholder group that would help implement, at that time, Alberta's first clean air strategy. We've got multi-sector membership, industry, government, and NGOs. And although Airsheds are not a formal part of CASA, they're an integral part of the work that CASA does and very involved in many of our projects, as you'll see in a minute. And it's a collaborative, consensus-based decision-making process. Those of you who've been involved with consensus-based decision-making processes, they can be challenging at times and take some extra effort. But in the end, if you can reach consensus on things when you've got all the stakeholders around the table, the chances of getting something done are much greater. And the real focus for CASA is to provide advice to the province on air quality management issues. And I think CASA's got a pretty long and illustrious record of providing good policy advice, thanks to all the stakeholders putting their shoulder to the wheel and trying to develop practical, implementable recommendations for policy limits, whatever they are. Next, please, Julie. And this idea for this project was presented at a June 2020 CASA board meeting. As Kevin said, it was very obvious at that time that, boy, oh boy, those measures that were associated with COVID-19 in terms of work from home, virtual meetings, had a huge impact on traffic counts in the province. And on the right, this is California, and approximately the same time of day, non-COVID and COVID. So you can see it was just huge, the difference. And I live in the second busiest street in St. Albert after St. Albert Trail. And it was just amazing. At lunchtime, I could walk down the middle of Boudreaux Road. It was really unbelievable. So huge difference in traffic counts. And so we wanted to look at that. How big was it? What were the air quality impacts? And then communicate those findings to the public and to give some messages about how the basic things we do as a society, when there are some changes, they can really have an impact in other areas like traffic, air pollution. And CASA has been involved in a number of projects that have a strong transportation component. One was the non-point source project, which we finished a couple of years ago. And of course, transportation emissions are major non-point sources. And then the ROVR project, which is roadside optical vehicle emission recorder. We've just finished a couple of years, COVID interrupted that a bit, of looking at vehicle emissions at various parts of the province. And now the team that's doing that work is trying to put those results into a context for a final report. And we've talked a little with Julie and Kevin about that it would be nice to have a webinar on those results, because there really is some interesting data from that. Next, please, Julie. And this was the project team membership. We had good representation. Highlight on the lower left-hand side, we had two folks from the Alberta Airsheds Council, Kevin Warren and Mike Basaga, some Alberta Environment folks, Health Canada, an academic who's very involved with transportation and transportation emissions from the Simon Fraser University, and industry folks, CAP, Canadian Fuels, Forest Products, and so on. And it really was a good team, and we had lots of work to do, but we had fun doing it, which is sort of a characteristic of CASA projects. And if any of you have the opportunity to participate in a project, please consider it, because it really is an interesting and worthwhile experience. That's my pitch for CASA. Julie, next, please. So transportation and air quality. Of course, transportation is integral to our society. Many air pollutants associated with vehicle emissions. I'm going to give you a list of them. There's lots. And you know, we've been on a trajectory to try and reduce transportation-related emissions through better emission control requirements, but we still have lots of vehicle emissions because vehicle numbers in Canada are relatively high on a per capita basis. They're very high. We've got lots of older models that are still on the road. Cars last a lot longer, which is good, and maybe not so good from an emission standpoint. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, that the total kilometers traveled by vehicles continues to go up. And I think we all know that research has shown that air pollution associated with vehicles and air pollution in general have fairly significant health implications. And I'll talk just a little more about that. And surprisingly, and this is based on some information from the University of Toronto, that, you know, approximately a third of all Canadians live within 250 meters of a major roadway. Now, that's not quite the case in Alberta, which is maybe good. The estimate that folks in Toronto made when they looked at the country as a whole was that for Alberta, it's about 12%. Next, please, Julie. And when we talk about health effects, there's a lot of focus on certain health effects. And this pyramid, which we talk about in the report, kind of indicates that the proportion of the population that's affected by air pollution is quite large, but those effects for probably all of us in some way, shape, or form are affected. But, you know, the effects are fortunately for most of us relatively minor. But when you start to go up this pyramid and the effects get a little more serious, and a lot of people, young people, old people, those that are compromised in some ways, asthmatic, COPD, all of those things, you know, they're the ones that end up at the top, unfortunately, of this health effects pyramid. Next, please, Julie. And I mentioned transportation-related primary and secondary air pollutants. Long list, there's a focus generally on NOx emissions, particulate emissions, VOC emissions, but there's a lot of emissions at some levels, some much higher than others. And as exhaust requirements have improved and so on, there's now been more of an emphasis on non-exhaust related vehicle emissions and potential health and environmental implications. And I've listed 5 of those there. Brake wear in particular. And when you look at electric vehicles, for example, very heavy vehicles in terms of braking. So brake wear becomes an issue. And so brake wear emissions have now been the focus of some studies that have come out recently. Next, please, Julie. And put NOx emissions, which are a major emission source type associated with vehicles. This is some data from the non-point source report. I won't go into it. The red at the bottom, approximately 40% of the total NOx emissions in Alberta are associated with on and off-road gasoline and diesel emission sources. Next, please, Julie. And so why did we talk about air pollution and health in this report? And it was a big part of the report, a major component of the report. And the reason we did that is that, okay, we knew that we were going to see some air quality improvements that could be linked to reduced transportation as a result of COVID measures. But then the obvious question is, so what? The NOx is X, now it's X minus Y. So what? What's the big deal? And so what we wanted to get across and try and get across is that, hey, those emissions have health impacts. And so there's a real benefit to trying to reduce vehicle emissions. And maybe COVID gave us some lessons in what those alternatives were. And so we did try and do this. And I'm glad Kevin showed the Air Quality Health Index, because that's the measure we used. Next, please, Julie. And why did we use the Air Quality Health Index? Well, this is an excerpt from the report. There was a study done in Edmonton regarding the Air Quality Health Index and linkage to emergency department visits for stroke-related impacts. And they definitely found that, or they felt that there was they could link Air Quality Health Index to increases in emergency department visits. There's been other work on that in Ontario related to asthma. And so we felt that, and the Air Quality Health Index is, of course, based on looking at air quality and health impacts. So we did use that as a sort of trying to demonstrate that, hey, that reduced transportation, improved air quality really did have some benefits as measured by the Air Quality Health Index. Next, please. And I took this is January 11th, 2022. Of course, in Alberta here, we get winter smog events, and this is just the Air Quality Health Index for that January 11th. And you can see in all of the bigger urban areas, and those of us, I live in St. Albert, so I'm on the edge, but definitely some elevated Air Quality Health Index numbers. Next, please, Julie. Okay, now this is where Yayne comes in. Is Yayne joined us?
No, she hasn't been able to. So go ahead, you're on.
Okay, so and maybe we'll have to do another little quick thing here, because I do have some more information that I can hopefully provide. So we had some key messages, and many of us, or probably all of us, are familiar with some of those key messages with respect to automobile emissions. You know, anti-idling, keep your engine tuned up. You know, don't try and do three things when you take your car out of the garage or your parking lot, and instead of making 3 separate trips. So we had probably we tried to gather all of those up, and there's a lot of them. So we probably have 50 or 60 messages related to things that individuals or organizations, we had some for government, some for industry, and then some for that we could all contribute to. And recognizing that, you know, some would have major impacts or significant impacts, and others probably minimal, but a whole bunch of everybody doing minimal things can add up to something that's meaningful. And we, in the report, we give lots of resources, and I was actually amazed at all the resources that are available and how useful and easy they are to understand and get messages from. So I'd urge you, if you're at all interested in that, to go to the report and look at all of those resources. And if any tweak your interest, go to them, because as I say, I was amazed at just the information that's out there, a lot of it from Natural Resources Canada, but really useful stuff, smart way for fleet vehicles, smart drivers, so on. So yeah, lots of information available on how to reduce our transportation emission footprint. Next, please, Julie. So this is just the quick links to get the information. The final report is got some technical stuff in it with lots of references for everything that we put in there. So it's I think a good reference document if you're interested in air pollution and health and traffic related impacts on health, or what we saw in terms of improved traffic. And there were some interesting things which I may have to talk about in a minute if Yayne doesn't join us. So that next, maybe the next slide, Julie, we'll skip that one for the moment. And one of the things that if we had time, and I guess, Julie, I'll stop after this one, that what are emissions in Alberta compared, vehicle emissions in Alberta compared to other parts of the country and Canada in total? And what is interesting is that in terms of diesel emissions, Alberta's got the highest of any of the provinces. And you can see for NOx makes up a significant portion of the total diesel, on and off road diesel NOx emissions in the country. And part of this is associated with the oil sands mining operations and all the heavy haulers that are involved in mining oil sands. But in terms of diesel emissions, we're pretty high. And in some cases, as the Rover project has shown us, some of those heavy duty on-road diesel vehicles are huge polluters. And there, from my perspective, definitely has to be a focus on trying to get those vehicles either off the road or to get their emission control equipment operating properly. And that's one of the recommendations we have in this report, in fact. Now, in terms of gasoline emissions, we sort of follow the Ontario #1, Quebec #2, Alberta #3. BC is sometimes close to us and for some of the things, but for the most part, we're third. And when you look at emissions tons per year per 1,000 population, we're the highest. So we definitely do lots of driving in Alberta. So Julie, I think we need time for questions. So we can go back to the previous slide.
Perfect. Thank you, David, for that presentation and for stepping up that way. We've had a few really great questions come in, and before we get to questions, what I'd like to do, and Russ, you can actually probably stop the screen share there. Perfect. Before we get to questions, I just want to flag for folks on the call that Alberta Capital Airshed hosted another webinar last September 2021, about urban transportation choices and air quality. And we had 3 panelists come out for that one. There was Carrie Houghton-McDonald from the city of Edmonton speaking about Edmonton Transit Service and air quality. We also had Andrea Solar from the city talking about Edmonton's electric vehicle strategy, as well as Stephen Rates from Paths for People talking about the potential for bike share in Edmonton. So if you're interested in sort of that Edmonton context when it comes to some choices, maybe mapping some of the recommendations that CASA's report has to some of the other conversations that have been happening, I encourage you to check out that webinar recording, which you can find on the Alberta Capital Airshed website or YouTube channel. So now with that, let's get to some Q&A. What I'll tell you, David, when you put up that chart with the diesel emissions, that's when those questions really took off. Okay, so let's get to them. Here's our first question. Curious where EVs, so electric vehicles, would rank in sources of various pollutants given non-emission pollution, like the brakes and tires and things like that you mentioned, David, particularly given their heavier weight and that the footprint related, that there's a footprint related to the electricity. While the transition will move us away from individual combustion engines, which is good, EVs may not be, the answer that some people think that they are. Might be a good argument for light rail, active transportation, etc. So here's the question. What research is being done in Alberta on fully understanding the impact of transportation choices? So I'll hand that over to either one of you, just jump in, and then the other one can supplement. So are you guys aware of what other research might be done around this and choosing those really thoughtful transportation choices when it comes to air quality considerations?
Kevin, I'll take an initial start. I do drive an electric vehicle. So I am interested in many of the things that person asked. In terms of emissions associated with my electric vehicle is, of course, where's the electricity coming from that I'm charging my vehicle with? And, there's a website that you can look at that for each province in Canada that tells you, if you're driving an electric car, what on average your GHG emissions are. And for example, if you're driving in BC, Manitoba, Quebec, very, very low GHG emissions. And because it's mostly hydropower, very clean. And in Alberta, I think we're probably the worst. in terms of GHG emissions, and I think it's about 40%. My vehicle has about 40% of, and I forget what the parameter is, well, it's GHG in that case, GHG emissions compared to a gasoline engine. So it still is, from a GHG emission standpoint, a improvement, but definitely not ideal. And I think in terms of work in Alberta, and maybe Kevin's got a better feel for it, I have not seen anything specific to it, but I have tried to track information from other areas, like this issue of brake-related emissions from electric vehicles, because they are much heavier than a normal passenger vehicle. Now, there's an advantage because depending on your electric vehicle, if you get, if you're on full regenerative capacity, for example, in my car, I hardly ever use my brakes, because when I take my foot off the accelerator, it basically brakes. And all that energy from slowing down goes back into my battery. Kevin, Alberta, specific stuff?
The one thing I'm thinking right off the bat, David, is the climate lens assessment. So often when we have big infrastructure projects, especially even in transportation section, we will do the climate lens. So that's based on the federal government, in order to tap into some of that infrastructure money. So anything over $10 million, essentially, you're looking at having to do one of those major projects. And then all of the GHG calculations are done from the emission side. And part of it is to say, where's the savings? So if we're doing a new road, one of the things that they're looking at is that where's that bicycle pathway? Because you're going to be taking one vehicle lane out, potentially, putting bicycles in there in order to compensate or to try and reduce your emissions. So I know a lot of those kind of assessments have been done across Canada, for sure.
Perfect. Thank you both for taking a stab at that question. I also want to say that we have had confirmation that Yayne will not be able to join us today due to an emergency. So we do wish her well and welcome her expertise again, at a future webinar. Some really great work that she does. So another question that we have coming in is around and this was kind of sort of touched on, but let's touch on it a bit more, is what's being done to phase out diesel engines, especially in those dense urban environments. But I'm going to add to that question, when we think about diesel engines, even in less populated areas, where the geography of the area may actually contribute to the negative health impacts of that diesel in the area. So what's being done to phase out diesel engines, if anything, at this point? We're going to go to Kevin first on this one.
Okay, thank you.
I just got to look at it as the economics to the cost of diesel right now compared to, like, if you keep increasing the cost, it's the typical economics is going to answer that one for us. I think of some of the work overseas as well, where they pretty much were phasing out diesel in some of the communities in Europe, just because of the emissions. And it hasn't quite come here, but I know from our perspective, a lot of people have moved away from the diesel side, even like some of the buses. And I'm thinking of school buses in particular. Gasoline, they've tried to move away from diesel altogether. Definitely the push to try and move to something newer, different alternate fuels, but diesel is one of the things that they've tried to move away from. David, do you have any other interests? I'm sorry, I'm just answering one of the questions in there as well, because somebody had asked, what other project is CASA working on? So I'm just typing in that link to CASA is there as well. Yeah. So.
I think, diesel engines, and a long time ago, I actually had a diesel car, that, huge strides have been made in trying to minimize NOx and particulate emissions from diesel vehicles. And unfortunately, early on, those technologies were presented some challenges and difficulties for owners that had vehicles with those. And the unfortunate consequence of that unfortunate circumstance was people did away with those exhaust control systems. And then we had the issue where manufacturers like Volkswagen and Fiat that produces Jeep and Ram trucks, passenger light duty vehicles, they actually had defeat devices on those. So if properly maintained and operated, the diesel diesel vehicle emissions can be controlled to a certain level. Ideally, you want to switch fuels. I know that, where there are big fleets, like in the oil sands mining, looking at liquefied natural gas, they are looking at hydrogen, they are looking at electric vehicles. And we've seen, a lot of the delivery, a lot of the companies that do lots of delivery work, looking at going to electric vehicles. So there's a lot happening. It's probably going to be 10 years down the road before we see a huge shift, but it's going to come. There's no question. Diesel engines have been wonderful things, but their time is coming to an end, and hopefully what replaces them will do equally well in terms of providing the services we need.
Perfect. And, that's a good point too, right? It's not about saying, oh, this is so bad or something. It's about saying, time to move forward and still get the job done, right? So we've had quite a few folks ask questions about that chart that you had up in your presentation, David. So I'm going to ask Russ to pull back up your presentation for us. In case you don't know, we have Russ Biagawa working in the background, helping to support the technical aspect of this webinar. And here are the couple of questions in relation to that slide while it's being brought up. One is, so from this attendee, when comparing diesel and gas emissions against other provinces in the nation, is there more up-to-date data? They're noting that they see 2012 to 2013 data. So that's one piece. And then there's a follow-up that we'll get to later. Did either of you have anything to say about that while we're getting that, that slide brought up? Just around the up-to-dateness of the data?
There is better data. Vehicle emission data is unlike a lot of industrial point source data that we have up-to-date estimates. It's not quite so easy with transportation related emissions. And often they're based on emission factors, so they're not actually measured, they're based on emission factors. And so there's quite a bit of uncertainty associated with the numbers. And so I wish, and when we did this report and this particular section, Anne and Ruth and I worked on behalf of the Engel Group, I chose these numbers because they were there in these published reports by Health Canada, and it was easy. But there are better numbers, but they're very hard to pull together and put into some kind of a national context like this. So in Alberta, of course, we do have estimates based on vehicle counts, model numbers, model years, so on, for the oil sands mining, which is a huge, as I indicated, a huge vehicle-related emission source in the province. Those numbers, because I look at them and try and estimate them all the time, they're pretty, sort of plus or minus 25%. So it's a very good question. I wish there were an easy way to get this information, but there just isn't. I'm thinking Environment Canada, the website, I'm just trying to think of the name of it. You can go and get estimates, and that's all they are. And I think, based on the looking I've done, that these numbers in terms of absolute, of course, there's uncertainty, but relatively speaking, I think they're still pretty accurate to where we sit as a province versus other provinces.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was sort of the second question that came up is, we're at just about 10 years later from the data that's presented here. And, the question was, is this kind of about where Alberta would still rank, do we think? So sounds like that might be the case. We don't know for sure, but that's sort of where things would indicate. Kevin, did you have anything else to add to this question about up-to-date data on this?
One of the things that David talked about is my mind goes to MPRI, David, where you have more up-to-date information from industrial emitters, and they have some of their fleet information in it. But unfortunately, that is just the industry side of things. So we don't see the population side. We don't see everybody else having information in there, rather just the industrial emitters. And so it'll be skewed on the one side from that perspective if you're just looking at that information, because you have to look at the whole picture from there.
Great. So the next question is a bit related to this, and we can stop the screen share anytime, Russ, if that works, is what monitoring is being done to capture roadside emissions? Could you speak to that a bit?
That's a very good question. And we have a recommendation in the report that we look at getting some roadside monitoring. Now, the rover project is very vehicle specific. It gives you an idea of what air quality might be beside a roadside. But in Alberta, and Kevin can answer this better than I can, but there our ambient air monitoring network, which is really a wonderful network, thanks in large part to Airsheds, but there's a requirement that you be a certain distance from a roadway. Whereas when you go, and some of the studies that have been done, like Vancouver, Toronto, they've got those monitors right beside the street on a busy street, right, to get an idea of what ground level concentrations are if you're walking down, for example, Jasper Avenue or whatever the avenue is. Kevin?
I was going to say, can I share my screen for a second? Just
Yeah, you should be able to just share it.
So I just pulling this one up, David. So here's like a snapshot of just the NO2 data from all of our samples from all the Airsheds, but I've just got ECA identified here. So you can actually go in and start to look at some of these locations where the monitors are based on the road and get a better indication of what's actually happening. But you're absolutely correct, based on where we've got some of these layouts, we distance from some of the roads. So what we often will then go with, and I'm just gonna show some of the trends that we'll look at, is when do we see some of the patterns of our emissions. So the time of day, the day of year, or the week, and so forth. But in particular, where we want to see it more interestingly is this type of pattern. where we see that distinct, when we look at industry emissions, we tend to see a fairly flat line, very repetitive pattern. When we tend to look at ozone, it's very repetitive or day over day type of thing in the rural areas in particular. But when we look at NOx, we tend to have a very interesting weekday pattern versus a weekend pattern. And we tend to look then more at some of our vehicle emissions, so we're seeing some of these things. So we're still picking it up at some of our stations. This just happens to be Edmonton East Station. So we are picking it up, but this is probably one of the closest to roads, so I use it as an example. The distance from our roadways for sure. Now I got to figure out how to stop sharing again.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, Kevin, because, I'm looking at, David mentioned that there's these little backgrounders as part of the report. You can't quite see it with my screen there, but, it's a quick little 6-pager with just a few key takeaways. And in there, it really mentions how, during the COVID-19 public health emergency, that the volume of morning commuters dropped by approximately 45%. So when we think about that pattern that you just showed us, Kevin, I mean, a drop in 45% traffic, it's quite an interesting thing to think about when it comes to air quality. So, and any other comments on that one before we move to the next question?
I was just going to say that last one with the NOx, that we noticed the biggest improvement in the morning, not so much in the afternoon. That traffic seems to be spread out a lot more, but that morning rush, right? Yeah, so that was good. Thanks, Kevin.
Wonderful. Okay, we're going to have one last question and then we're going to wrap up today's webinar. So the last question is, CASA, you do a lot of really collaborative work, and so do Airsheds. So if Airsheds were to continue this discussion, what should the focus of the next webinar be? Who might be some good speakers? And, from our audience, I mean, what do you want to hear? So over to you, I guess. David, we'll put you on the spot first and then over to Kevin.
Well, I think there are so many things, but I mentioned the rover project. We've just finished, the CAKES achievement because of the NO2 air quality challenges we have in the province. And as an ENGO rep on CASA, one of the ENGO reps, we've really been pushing for trying to create more awareness on air quality and health issues. Because I really believe that there's a lot of Albertans that, relative to a lot of places, we have good air quality, but that doesn't mean we don't have health-related issues associated with our air quality. So those are three, Julie, that come to mind for me.
Great, really appreciate that. Go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say definitely the rover would be an interesting presentation. I think another good presentation would be David in his electric vehicle with a GoPro. And I think that would be, but in all honesty, the side of the health was one of the things that we had talked about before, and it definitely is an interest, especially when we start to look at some of the broad swath of data that we have, and we start doing some of the comparisons to our population centers, and just taking a better look at it for sure.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I really want to thank you both for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. And I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of folks working behind the scenes. As mentioned before, Russ Miyagawa on technical support, Serena Tang, who will be putting out some great post-webinar social media posts that you can watch for on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter channels, as well as perhaps the occasional LinkedIn post. And just real appreciation to the other Airsheds and member organizations that shared information about this upcoming webinar to help invite others to come and join us today and learn a bit more about transportation impacts on air quality. So with that, that's a wrap. Thank you again for everyone who participated, to our panelists here, and we will see you at the next Clean Air webinar. Have a good day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.